students, Mr. Cohen here. Today we are going to be building upon what you've been learning as you've gone through the tutorial on Athens and Sparta in Edementum, and I would presume you're nearly finished with the tutorials and the activity. Today is the last day on that. This should build upon it, and I want to first of all actually look at Sparta rather than Athens. Very often we'll actually, I've already gone over a little bit on Athens with you, and the tutorial will focus quite heavily on Athens. Let's look at Sparta though, a very different city-state from that of Athens. Athens very much focused on the arts and developing democracy at certain points in its history. Sparta very much focused on building a strong army, and whereas Athens had a strong navy, it needed a strong navy, it was close to the water. Sparta very much focused on its military, and you'll see that in the training from a very young age of its young men.
In ancient Greece.
Oh, before we start, I do want you to think, while we're learning about these two city-states, which of the two would you rather have lived in at that time? It might be different if you're male in one place, or different as a female in another place. I want you to think which place would suit you the most. Neither place was perfect for females, by the way, compared to the way women live today in the modern world. The rights that they had were quite limited in both city-states.
Violent internal conflict between border neighbors and war with foreign invaders was a way of life, and Greeks were considered premier warriors. Most Greek city-states surrounded themselves with massive defensive walls for added protection. Sparta, in its prime, was a different story, finding walls unnecessary when it had an army of the most feared warriors in the ancient world. So what was Sparta doing differently than everyone else to produce such fierce soldiers? To answer that question, we turn to the written accounts of that time. There are no surviving written accounts from Spartans themselves, as it was forbidden for Spartans to keep records. So we have to rely on those of non-Spartan ancient historians, like Herodotus, Thucydides, and Plutarch. These stories may be embellished and depict Sparta at the apex of its power.
Embellish means like exaggerating a story, and apex of their history means at the peak of their history. So sometimes historians might have exaggerated certain events. By the way, if you can hear the snoring in the background, it's the two pugs. Sorry about the disturbance if you can hear them.
So take them with a grain of salt. For Spartans, the purpose for their existence was simple: to serve Sparta. On the day of their birth, elder Spartan leaders examined every newborn. The strong, healthy babies were considered capable of fulfilling this purpose, and the others may have been left on Mount Taygetus to die. Every Spartan, boy or girl, was expected to be physically strong, mentally sharp, and emotionally resilient, and it was their absolute duty to defend and promote Sparta at all costs. So in the first years of their lives, children were raised to understand that their loyalty belonged first to Sparta and then to family. This mindset probably made it easier for the Spartan boys, who upon turning 7 were sent to the Agoge, a place with one main purpose: to turn a boy into a Spartan warrior through 13 years of relentless, harsh, and often brutal training. The Spartans prized physical perfection above all else, and so the students spent a great deal of their time learning how to fight. To ensure resilience in battle.
Now, as you watch the next couple of minutes of this video, you'll notice some of the values of this society, the Spartan society, very different than our own. Things that they valued we would look down upon today.
Boys were encouraged to fight among themselves, and bullying, unlike today, was acceptable. In order to better prepare the boys for the conditions of war, the boys were poorly fed, sometimes even going days without eating. They also were given little in the way of clothing, so that they could learn to deal with different temperatures. Spartan boys were encouraged to steal in order to survive, but if they were caught, they would be disciplined.
Now, one of the reasons they're treating their young men this way is because they see that in the future these men are going to be warriors, and for example they might be in a land where they've got to survive off the land and they might have to steal food, and they're treating them to be quite brutal. They want them to be the most warlike warriors with little empathy for others, and this is part of their training. Notice that these young men aren't punished for their wrongdoings as we would see them. They're punished for being caught.
Not because they stole, but because they were caught in the act. During the annual contest of endurance in a religious ritual known as the Diamastigosis, teenage boys were whipped in front of an altar at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. It was common for boys to die on the altar of the goddess. Fortunately, not everything was as brutal as that. Young Spartans were also taught how to read, write, and dance, which taught them graceful control of their movements and helped them in combat. While the responsibilities for the girls of Sparta were different.
Now notice here, this city-state, when we sometimes compare it with Athens, we tend to think of it as a little bit backwards compared to Athens. Athens was known for the arts and learning, philosophy, the love of learning, what we call philosophy, but in some ways the women of Athens were kind of held back. Well, in several ways. We'll look at that later, but let's look at the rights that women in this very male-dominated society called Sparta, look at the rights that they had.
Different. The high standards of excellence and expectation to serve Sparta with their lives remained the same. Spartan girls lived at home with their mothers as they attended school. Their curriculum included the arts, music, dance, reading, and writing. And to stay in peak physical condition, they learned a variety of sports, such as discus, javelin, and horseback riding. In Sparta, it was believed that only strong and capable women could bear children that would one day become strong and capable warriors. To all Spartans, men and women, perhaps the most important lesson from Spartan school was allegiance to Sparta. To die for their city-state was seen as the completion of one's duty to Sparta. Upon their death, only men who died in battle and women who died in childbirth were given tombstones. In the eyes of their countrymen, both died so that Sparta could live.
So, very interesting city-state, and it's kind of interesting to see how harsh it was, and yet women had so many rights compared to some other parts of the world, most parts of the world at that time. Let's take a look. Let's do a little bit of a comparison here. So, let's go here. So, let's look at Athens. Athens, over 2,400 years ago, there was a famous Greek general, Pericles, and Pericles was mentioned in your tutorial. He said, "It is true that we, Athenians, people of Athens, are called a democracy." And if you remember, democracy means rule by the who, or power of the who. It's power of the people. Demo meaning people, krasi meaning power or rule by. For the administration is in the hands of the many meaning the people, and not the few, with equal justice to all alike in their private disputes. Now what that's saying is that the power is in the hands of the people and that everybody gets justice. Well, really, that is not totally accurate, because not everybody was considered a citizen, and women who were considered citizens did not have the same rights as men. Here we see Athens. We've even got the airport shown there, and you notice many of these Greek islands, and Sparta over here on this peninsula that comes off the rest of Greece, which is a peninsula itself. And by the way, this is a canal that goes through it. It's a human-made canal, but this is all one big peninsula, Greece, almost surrounded by water here to the south and also to the east, peninsula. So in the beginning, you learned in your tutorial about Solon. Solon, we could say, sets a foundation or prepares things for the start of democracy. There was an oligarchy, a relatively small group of very wealthy aristocrats, like landowners, aristocrats, very often in these times were wealthy landowners. And he was also a noble or an aristocrat, but he decides that the debt should be forgiven for the poor, and he wants more participation in government by citizens. Then we get this tyrant. We've got a tyranny, Pisistratus. He gave loans and offered a fresh start to people, and he redistributed the nobles' land. So he took some of the land away from the aristocracy, and he did create jobs for poor people who had lost farms. So he's a popular tyrant. Cleisthenes, we say, is credited with making Athens a democracy. Say Cleisthenes makes Athens a democracy. He's also from a family of wealth and power, also an aristocrat. And he divides Athens into 10 tribes, and none are dominated by people with great wealth. Now notice it says what kind of citizens could debate and hear court cases and appoint army generals. Only male citizens, not females. Cleisthenes' reforms did not include all members of society, so women weren't included, and obviously not slaves, and foreign-born men were still excluded too. But it was every citizen's duty to participate in government. In fact, they would send slaves out, and if people who were considered citizens were meant to be voting on a certain issue that day and they weren't there, slaves would go around rounding them up, and they'd have a piece of rope with like red dye on it, a red paint on it, and they'd put that on the clothing of the citizens that were meant to be voting who were maybe in the marketplace, and they would mark their clothing. It would be a sign of embarrassment and shame. And the word idiot actually comes from ancient Greece, and it's describing people who were citizens who didn't participate in government. So democracy is born out of the belief that no one person or group should make the laws, and that citizens could choose government officials and vote for or against laws. And they would they had what we call a direct democracy. So because Athens had a relatively small group of citizens, a smaller population, they could all gather to vote and discuss the issues of the day. And obviously in the United States we have a huge population, so that is not possible. We have a representative type government where we choose people, senators and representatives, to make those decisions in government for us. I think you might be able to hear Pablo snoring in the background, or he's dreaming. Sorry about that. So Athens' democracy, as we've heard, is not perfect, but it's establishing the roots of democracy for the rest of the world to follow later on. It's not perfect because not everybody was allowed to vote. Just like when this country started, women could not vote. It was mainly landowning Americans that could participate in government when the United States first started. African Americans couldn't vote either. Okay, they were not considered worthy of the full vote. Representative democracy is the kind of democracy that we have, and like I said, we have representatives that make laws that govern the people, and because we have a large population, we have to vote for representatives or senators to make the laws for us. So let's look at the differences between males and females in Athens. Well, for boys, there was a focus on creating well-rounded Athenians, people of Athens, with healthy minds. And so they're not just talking about training their young men as warriors like in Sparta. They did teach them to read, write, taught them in math, playing musical instruments like the lyre and singing. And all male citizens, though, were required to serve in the military for at least 2 years. Now let's look at the rights of females. Mainly, Pablo, what kind of noise is that? Okay. Mums taught the daughters to spin yarn, weave, and other household duties. And only in some wealthy homes did girls learn to read, write, and play musical instruments. Women were considered property of their husbands. So as we see here, the women aren't given the same kind of freedoms as the women of Sparta. And it's interesting because we always think of Athens as being the more forward thinking of the two city-states, but not on all issues. So, like I said, Athens, people think of it as the place of being at that time. Thinkers are welcome. Philosophers. Philo means love of. Sophos comes from the word Sophie, for the Greek word for wisdom or knowledge. So if you're called Sophie or Sophia, or you know someone with that name, it comes from Greek meaning wise one. Wisdom, philosopher, lover of wisdom. So people who love to think about things, think out problems, get you to question. Philosophers. Also the arts, amazing sculptures in Athens, and theatre. Again, guess who could not act, who was not allowed to act in the theatre? They could go and watch, but they could not act, who were not allowed to act? Females. So, same with the Olympics. The Olympics, women were not allowed to participate in the Olympics or watch at the Olympics either. Now, we did talk about the army of Sparta. In Athens, slightly different focus. The focus is more on the navy. They're close to the water. The closest port today is Piraeus, where you get the boats to the island. This was a major port at the time. Here we see a picture of an Athenian trireme. So tri meaning three rows of oars. And they focused on the navy for defending their territory. Interestingly, the slaves, some slaves were even given positions of power, sometimes even as police chiefs, and these were trusted slaves, and also as tutors. So their slaves were people that they'd taken in battles. They could be from other Greek city-states, their slaves, or from Persia when they fought with the Persians. These prisoners of war would become slaves. They were the lowest social class in Athens, and a quarter to a third of the population were slaves. So a lot of the work is being done by people who are not citizens, enslaved people taken very often as prisoners of war. Some of them they would have found were possibly educated in certain subjects, and so they would have used them as tutors. Okay. So two very different city-states. Which city-state would you like to have lived in? Now, in my resources, I've taken these from my Ancient Greece module. I'm also going to put a link in here for the activities and games in the British Museum site. And I'd like you to, if you're finished with your tutorial, that's excellent. And these are just to build upon that tutorial to help you with what you've been learning in the tutorial. Okay, students, grades will be going in the next couple of days, and I wish you all the best for today. Thank you very much, and thank you for putting up with the snoring in the background. Really, it was not Mrs. Cohen, it was Pablo and Cecil. Okay, have a great day. Bye for now.